The night Lady Dunmore's annual autumn dinner fell apart, it began with a pair of gloves. Mira Ashfield noticed the moment she sat down. 12 guests arranged around a table set for 14, the extra chairs conspicuous as accusations. She had counted them twice, the way she counted everything, habit from years of keeping her father's court records, where a single misplaced number could ruin a man. The gloves lay beside her place setting, ivory kid leather, pressed flat, as if someone had laid hands on them and smoothed away every wrinkle. They were not hers. She said nothing. She was good at saying nothing. This was her 3rd week at Dunmore Hall, and in those 3 weeks Mira had learned the particular architecture of silence that governed the place. There was the silence of the servants, who moved through the corridors like water finding cracks in stone. There was the silence of Lord Dunmore himself, Callum, though she had not yet found occasion to call him that, who sat at the head of the table and watched his guests with the attentiveness of a man reading a document he already knew to be fraudulent. And there was the silence of his younger sister, Lady Constance Ardmore, who sat 3 chairs to Mira's left and had not once in 21 days spoken to her directly. She spoke about her, though, loudly and with great warmth, the way one describes a stain on a favourite tablecloth to the assembled dinner party, rather than simply blotting it. "My brother has always had such interesting taste," Constance had said the first evening, addressing the air above Mira's head. A magistrate's daughter, one does admire the novelty. A magistrate's daughter who could read Latin contracts faster than most barristers, who had spent 7 years managing her ailing father's caseload from a back room in their village courthouse, and who had, 6 months ago, made the catastrophic error of catching the attention of Callum Ardmore, Earl of Dunmore, when she correctly identified a forged land deed that 3 of his solicitors had passed without comment. She had not expected him to come back. She had not expected any of it. The candles along the centre of the table cast their light downward, pooling gold on the white linen. Mira kept her hands in her lap, away from the stranger's gloves, and watched the footman pour wine into her glass with the careful attention of someone who had learned to track threats from the edges of rooms. Constance was speaking to the woman beside her, Lady Pembroke, who had arrived that afternoon with an enormous quantity of luggage and an equally enormous quantity of opinions. They were discussing the upcoming season in Edinburgh. Mira let the conversation wash past her and focused instead on the fact that her soup was cooling and that the empty chairs at the end of the table were bothering her in a way she could not name. "You're counting again." She looked up. Callum was watching her from the far end of the table, and there was something in his expression that might have been amusement, or might have been something more careful than that. In the 6 months she had known him, she had not yet learned to distinguish between those 2 things on his face. "The chairs," she said quietly. "My steward miscounted the guest list." He said it simply, without apology, and she believed him, because it was precisely the sort of administrative error that she herself would never have made, and that she had noticed 3 of his staff make in the past fortnight. "I'll speak to him tomorrow." "It's no matter," she said, though it was a little, in the obscure way that small imprecisions always bothered her. Constance's voice lifted from the far end of the table. "Mira, darling, you must be finding all of this terribly overwhelming. Such a change from village life." She said it the way one might say, "You must be finding the oxygen quite novel," and several of the guests smiled into their wine. Mira felt the familiar pressure at the base of her sternum, not quite anger, but adjacent to it, compressed. "Quite the opposite," she said pleasantly. "I find large gatherings very manageable. It's simply a matter of keeping track of who is where." She looked directly at Constance when she said it. Constance's smile did not falter. It had been engineered past faltering. This was the pattern of their days. Constance inserted needles with the precision of a woman who had spent her whole life learning exactly where the seams were. Mira extracted them with the same precision and put them somewhere private, and did not examine them until she was alone. What Mira had not told Callum, what she had not told anyone, was that she understood, more than most, what it cost to keep one's composure in a room that was working against you. She had been 14 when the first case involving a man who beat his wife came across her father's bench. She had been the one to transcribe the testimony. She had been 20 when she understood that the women who survived those situations were not the ones who wept in the courtroom. They were the ones who learned to be very, very still. She had learned to be very still. What she wore to dinner every evening was not accidental. The gowns Callum had arranged for her, hastily through his housekeeper, when it became clear she had arrived with clothes suited to a magistrate's household and not an earl's, were lovely, and several of them had backs she could not wear. She wore instead the ones that covered her shoulders, and over those she kept a shawl in the deep blue-grey of November sky. She wore it every evening. She had not explained why. The shawl was a fine thing, Norwich silk, and it suited her well enough that no one had thought to question it, or, if they had questioned it, Callum had not mentioned it to her. He was, she had discovered, a man who left doors open rather than forcing them, which was either a great courtesy or a great strategy, and she had not yet determined which. Constance had questioned it. Not directly, never directly. She had simply begun 3 days ago to make small comments about the temperature of the room, to ask whether Mira was perhaps feeling unwell, to observe that the other ladies seemed perfectly comfortable without wraps. Mira had smiled and said she ran cold. Tonight the fire was high. Tonight there were 12 guests and 2 empty chairs, and a pair of ivory gloves that did not belong to her. Tonight Constance was sitting 3 chairs to her left, and had been watching her with the focused attention of a woman who had made a decision. The soup was removed. The fish arrived. The conversation around the table rose and fell in that particular rhythm of people who are performing ease rather than experiencing it. Mira ate carefully and answered when she was spoken to, and did not touch the gloves. Callum, at the far end of the table, was engaged in what appeared to be a serious discussion with the man to his right, a Sir Harold, something or other from the border counties, who was very concerned about drainage. She caught Callum's eye once. He held it for a moment, in a way that was neither reassurance nor warning, simply attention, and then returned to the drainage problem. It was during the remove, the precise, suspended moment between courses when the footmen were clearing and the guests were reaching for their wine, that Constance moved. She did not stand. She was too practiced for that. She simply reached across the table under the pretense of retrieving something, the salt cellar, perhaps, or the dish of preserved fruit. And as she did, her fingers caught the edge of Mira's shawl. Later, Mira would think about the physics of it. The silk was light. Constance had rehearsed this, or something very like this. The shawl came away in a single smooth motion, the way a conjurer removes a cloth from a table. And for one long second, Mira felt the air of the room on the back of her neck and her shoulders, and the upper plane of her back, where she had carried, for the past 11 years, the record of what her late husband had done to her. The table went quiet. Not all at once. Sound doesn't stop all at once. It was a table of 12, and the silence moved around it, like a wave reaching a shore, one guest at a time becoming aware, one conversation at a time ceasing, until the only sound was the fire and the very distant clatter of something in the kitchen far below. Mira did not move. She had learned this. She had learned it the hard way and the long way, through years of standing in rooms where people looked at her as though she were a problem to be solved, and she had learned that the body's first response, to curl inward, to cover, to flee, was the one that cost you the most. She sat straight. She set her fork down on the rim of her plate with a small, precise sound. She breathed. Constance was saying something. Mira was aware of the words without processing them. Something about the shawl slipping, how terribly clumsy, how she had simply meant to. But the words were very far away, and what was close was the silence of the room and the heat of 12 pairs of eyes, and the sensation of air where there should have been silk. Constance. Callum's voice was not loud. That was the thing Mira would remember afterward. It was not loud at all, and yet it arrived in the room like a hand placed flat on a table. Something that stopped everything simply by existing. Constance stopped speaking. Return Lady Dunmore's shawl. The title landed strangely. He had not been calling her that. They had not yet married, were intended but not yet bound, and the title was premature, and everyone at the table knew it. But he said it with such absolute certainty, with the particular confidence of a man correcting a document that had been misfiled, that no one in the room appeared to register the presumption. Constance turned toward her brother with an expression that was working very hard to remain pleasant. The silk caught on my bracelet, I didn't mean. The shawl, he said again. She held it out. One of the footmen materialized, as footmen do, and carried it to Mira's chair, and Mira took it without looking at the boy, because she was looking at the tablecloth, at the particular weave of it, counting the threads the way she counted everything. Because if she looked up too quickly, she might let something show on her face that she was not ready to show. She put the shawl around her shoulders. She picked up her fork. "I believe Sir Harold was telling us about the drainage situation in the border counties," she said, in a voice that was perfectly even. "I'd like to hear more about that." There was a pause, and then Sir Harold, bless him, began again about the drainage. The rest of dinner passed. Mira ate what was put in front of her, and said the appropriate things at the appropriate moments, and watched, from the corner of her eye, as Constance's careful performance gradually became something else. Something tighter, something that looked, if you knew where to look, very much like the face of a woman who had miscalculated. When the ladies withdrew, Mira went with them. She sat in the drawing-room with her teacup, and listened to Lady Pembroke discuss her cousin's new townhouse, and smiled when smiling was required. Constance sat across the room and did not speak. When the gentleman rejoined them an hour later, Callum came to stand beside Mira's chair. He did not sit. He simply stood there, which was in itself a statement, and when Lady Pembroke eventually drew the rest of the group into a discussion of the card table, he bent slightly toward her. "Are you all right?" he asked. It was the kind of question that from some men would have been performance. From Callum, she had learned, it was simply a question. "Yes," she said. And then, because she had spent 11 years being precise about language, embarrassed, not frightened. "I'm past frightened." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him considering his words the way she would have, carefully, without haste. "I'd like you to tell me," he said, "if you're willing, what happened to you. Not tonight, but what happened?" She looked at her teacup. "That's a great deal to ask, I know." He did not soften it. She appreciated that. "I'm not asking you to decide now." In the end, she told him 2 days later, in the library, with the rain coming down outside and a fire going and a pot of tea between them that she poured herself because she needed to be doing something with her hands. She told him about George Ashfield, whom she had married at 22, because her father was ill and the household was failing, and there was no other option she could see. And about the years that followed, and about the morning she had come to her father's courthouse at 6 in the morning, before anyone else arrived, and sat in his chair and pulled out his casebooks, and begun to teach herself everything he knew, because she had understood that she would need, eventually, to be able to stand entirely on her own. George had died of a fever 4 years ago. She had mourned him with the particular exhausted grief of someone losing an opponent they had been fighting for so long that the fight had become its own strange intimacy. Callum listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, the rain was heavier, and the fire had burned lower, and the tea had gone entirely cold. "My first solicitor," he said after a while, "told me the Ardmore land deed transfer was clean. The second said the same. The third didn't even read it properly." He paused. "You read it in 11 minutes, 14, she corrected. "You read it in 14 minutes and found 3 separate irregularities that would have cost me roughly half the northern estate." He looked at her directly. "I came back because I needed someone I could trust to read things clearly. I stayed because you are the most precise person I have ever met, and because precision, in my experience, comes from having had to count very carefully for a very long time." She looked at him. He looked back. "I would like," he said, very carefully, "to give you reasons to count for different purposes." She said, "That's a very oblique proposal, my lord," he said. "I'm told I'm not very good at the direct approach." She said, "You were perfectly direct about the shawl." Something shifted in his face. That was not a moment that required obliqueness. She thought about the table, the silence. The particular way he had said Lady Dunmore, not as a slip, not as presumption, but as a correction, as if he were filing a document that had been in the wrong folder for too long and simply putting it where it belonged. "No," she agreed. "I suppose it wasn't. The rain came down, the fire wanted tending, neither of them moved immediately to tend it. What happened to Constance was not a dramatic banishment. Mira had expected drama. had steeled herself for it, had planned several responses to it. What happened instead was more surgical. Callum spent a morning with his sister in his study with the door closed, and when she emerged, Constance's face had the particular blankness of a person who has had a conversation they cannot argue their way back from. By evening, it was announced that Lady Constance Ardmore would be spending the winter with her maternal aunt in Inverness. By the following morning, her trunks were in the hall. She passed Mira in the corridor on her way out. Mira stood aside to let her pass. Constance stopped. She looked at Mira for a long moment, really looked, the first time she had done so without the performance layered over it, and what was underneath was more complicated than Mira had expected. Not simple cruelty, something older and more defended than that. "You won't last," Constance said. It came out flat rather than vicious, like a prediction rather than a wish. Mira thought about a great many things she could say. She thought about the 11 years she had already lasted, and the forged deed, and the courthouse at 6 in the morning, and the shawl, and the way Callum had said her title like a correction. "You might be surprised," she said pleasantly. Constance left. The hall was quiet. The footman who had carried her trunk to the carriage came back in and shut the door, and Dunmore Hall settled back into its rhythms, the particular sounds of a large house adjusting to its own weight. 3 months later, in the small chapel on the estate grounds, with snow coming down outside and Sir Harold among the witnesses and Lady Pembroke weeping cheerfully in the front pew, Mira became Lady Dunmore in fact as well as in Callum's preemptive corrections. She wore her hair up and a gown with a low back. It was the first time in 11 years she had worn something without covering her shoulders in public, and it turned out, significantly less momentous than she had feared. The scars were simply there. They were part of the record. They did not require concealment any more than her father's casebooks required concealment. They were simply evidence of things that had happened, annotated clearly, filed correctly, no longer in dispute. Callum's hand, when he took hers at the altar, was warm and certain in the way of a man who had made up his mind fully and without reservation. She had learned by then to recognize the difference between that and performance. She had spent 11 years learning to count very carefully. She had learned when numbers were missing. She had learned the shape of falsified documents and the weight of rooms arranged against her, and the particular silence that follows a shawl being pulled away in a candlelit dining room. She had also learned, later, and with more difficulty, to count the things that were simply straightforwardly present: a warm hand, a fire well maintained, a man who said her title like he was correcting a document that had been misfiled, putting it back where it belonged, which was with her. The snow came down, the chapel was warm. The witnesses applauded, and Mira, Lady Dunmore, permitted herself to be slightly less precise about counting for the rest of the afternoon.